Okay, the clock just struck 4:30, which means I'm already running out of time. Thank you for coming today. The very last session on the first day of the 2018 FileMaker Developer Conference, and I'm glad to see you here. Thank you for coming. My name is Doug Gardner. My company is Exoteric. We are FileMaker Platinum Partners in Toronto. We've got clients all across Canada and the United States, and we've been developing FileMaker databases for quite a long time, over 20 years now. The general philosophy of this session, I'm presenting ideas to you. And while I want to make them clear and understandable, I also hope that you will accept them critically and be thinking about what I'm saying and asking yourself whether it makes sense and be willing to challenge me and ask questions. We are not going to have a lot of time here in this room in our hour, but afterwards I will stay around and talk to whoever wants to talk for as long as they want to talk. As I like to say, ideally, DevCon is an idea exchange, not just a place to gather information. So with that said, I'm going to jump right in. This is FileMaker Calculation Fundamentals. So I'm going to start with some real basics. And if I am going too quickly, please don't hesitate to put up your hand, ask me to slow down. And if you have questions, put your hand up, and I will take your questions as I'm going along. If it makes sense, if I think that it doesn't make sense to take a question at that point, I'm going to ask you to just wait for a minute, and then I'll come back to you. We will make sure that hopefully no child will be left behind. So let's get started. I am just going to jump right in, and we are going to start with FileMaker's calculation window. And we're going to do that by going up here to File, choosing Manage, Manage Database, and we are going to define a field as a calculation. So as I said, we're starting out really with real fundamentals. And we're going to get moving a little bit more quickly once we've gotten past this very early stuff. So no eye rolling, please. So we're going to create our first calculation. And we're going to call it, let's call it our calculation. And then we come over here and we have to define the type of field that we're creating. We're going to define this field as a calculation. And when we do that, and we create the field, FileMaker opens up this window for us. This is the calculation window. We see this same window in different contexts throughout the database. I'm going to show you some other places where you see this same window and where you can do things with calculations as we're moving along. The very first thing that I want to do is introduce you a little bit to this window. On the left side, we have a list of fields that are in the table that we're currently looking at. And in the center, we've got a great big open space. This is where we actually write our calculation. Over on the right side, we have a list of different functions that we can use in our calculation. We're going to be spending some time talking about functions and how they work in FileMaker and how to think about them. And then we have a set of operators right here. These are for connecting different bits of text string together to form larger formulas. So if I'm zooming a little bit too much, please let me know. I'm going to zoom, though, so that people can see. It's not that easy, particularly, I think, if you're at the back. One thing I want to say right at the outset is that FileMaker has an absolutely fantastic help menu. And if you go to it, here, let me just show you what I did. There's a little question mark here. When you click on that, it opens up help, and right now it's explaining to us what we can do inside the specify calculation box. I highly, highly recommend that you take a look at FileMaker's ability to, or rather FileMaker's set of functions. So what we're going to do is we're going to, in a minute, when we start looking at FileMaker's functions, I'm going to drill in there. Well, actually, I'll drill in on one for you right now and just show you what I'm talking about here. So there is a function reference in here that's got a list of all of the functions that FileMaker has. I highly recommend reading through this list and just becoming aware of what's available. You do not have to remember how any of these things work. When you go in and you look at them, it will give you a detailed explanation about how they work. But the first step in solving a problem is knowing that it's possible to solve the problem. And I can't tell you how many times I've gone into FileMaker databases and seen incredibly creative, brilliant, and really fundamentally confused solutions to problems because people weren't aware of what was available to them. Read through the list of functions and just know that they're out there. You don't have to remember how they work. And then when the time comes, you can drill in, you can say, oh yeah, I think there's a function for that. You can go look it up and you can get in there. So that's a really quick introduction to the window. Notice down here at the bottom in the left, it says our calculation result is, and we can say that the result of our calculation is text, a number, a date, time, timestamp, or a container. We're going to talk about all of these. I'm going to explain what these mean in a minute. But for now, I'll just tell you that FileMaker stores these different types of field definitions. Its internal storage treats these in different ways, and it creates a different type of index for each of these. And if you know a little bit about how FileMaker is storing the data underneath, you can do some really cool things. I'm going to get there in just a minute. So I'm going to set it to text right now. And we are going to create our first calculation. Remember I said that in this window, we can write a formula. Well, a formula can be something very, very simple. A formula is just a calculation that returns a single value. So in here, I'm going to put in the simplest type of value that I can, and that's called literal text. It's also called a text constant. So I'm just going to write the word Bob in here. And then I'm going to go down, I'm going to close my calculation window, and FileMaker doesn't know what the heck I just did. I just typed the word Bob in here, tried to close the window, and FileMaker's looking for a field that's named Bob. When we type something in this window, FileMaker first says, is there a field that matches that thing? If there's a field, then FileMaker's fine with that because it will just, in that calculation, return whatever value happens to be in that field that I've selected. But in this particular case, there's no field named Bob, but I want Bob to show up in my calculation. So I have to do something like this. I have to put it in quotation marks. That's creating a text constant. It's called a constant because it does not change throughout the database. As I move around or go from record to record, the value in this field will always be Bob. I'm going to just put that in, and there it is. We can see Bob showing up in our window right now. I actually have, like a cooking show, done a little bit in advance here. Put a little checkbox in here so that I could hide some fields. I'm going to put in the first name field, I'm going to put Bob. In the last name field, I'm going to put Barker. And now we're going to go back in. And by the way, I'm going to use shortcuts now instead of going to the menu and dragging down each time. The first time I show, and then after that I'm trying to move as fast as I can. So remember I went into Manage, Database, and then I go into the Fields area right here. And now here's our calculation field right down here at the bottom. So that's what we're working on. I'm going to double click on that to open its window. And now we want to show Bob and Barker from those two fields that I just typed into. Well, over here on the left-hand side, I've got the first name field. So I'm going to put that in like that. I don't just want the first name, though. I also want the last name. So I'm going to double click over here on the last name field. When I double click, it puts it in right beside the first name field. And then I'm going to close my window, and the specified field can't be found. Why is that? Well, that's because FileMaker is looking for a field name, name underscore first, name underscore last, all together as a whole. We haven't told the calculation engine how to put these two things together yet. And so it just thinks they're a single thing. It just looks at them as a text blob. So we need to concatenate or to put together these two things. In order to do that, we use our operators that are in this strip right along here. And they're broken up into groups, and they haven't labeled the groups, so you kind of just have to know what the groups are. The first bunch are text operators. They're for managing or dealing with text. The second set are comparative operators. So you would use those mostly for math, but not necessarily. You could say Bob equals Robert, and that would evaluate to false. That's not true. So we've got equals, not equals, greater than, less than, greater than and equal, or less than and equal. And then we come down to our mathematical operators, plus, minus, divided by. The asterisk is for multiplication. Then we've got our logical operators. Not, this is a logical not. So it flips a value of something that's true to false, and something that's false, it will flip to true. And means that something on this side of our equation and is true, and something on this side of our equation, if it's true, then the thing as a whole is true. But otherwise, if either side of those is false, then as a whole, that thing is false. I'm going to explain this in a little more detail in a second. I'm just kind of going through it quickly right now. There's OR, there's XOR, which is an exclusive OR. So that means that this thing is true, or this thing is true, but not both. And if that's the case, that one but not both is true, then the whole thing evaluates to true. And then finally, the caret, that's for raising one number to the power of another number. So 3 caret 4 is raising 3 to the power of 4. That's just a basic look at this. So given what I've just said and what we're trying to do here, whoops, I typed one in by mistake. What we're trying to do here, we want to put the first name together with the last name. So we could do it. There's 3 candidates. There's the ampersand, there's the plus, and there's the and operator. Well, remember we said that the and is a logical operator. That's used for Boolean logic. Remember, Boolean logic is pretty simple. It's just a statement either evaluates to true or it evaluates to false. The plus is a mathematical operator. That's for adding 2 things together. We don't want that. Our last candidate's the ampersand. So we're going to put the ampersand in there. Whoops. We're going to put it in just once. We're going to put it, and then I'm going to close this window, and we're going to look at what we got. So there we go. We got Bob Barker, and but no space in between. So that's easy enough to fix. I'm just going to go in, and I'm going to add a space. I'm going to add a whole bunch of spaces. And then I'm going to close, and did not add any spaces in. Well, why is that? It's because, interestingly and very usefully, FileMaker ignores spaces in our calculation. And that's a very good thing, as we're going to see a little bit later on, because it allows us to format our calculations in ways that make them more readable. So if we want to put a space in there, we actually have to put that into quotation marks, just like we did with Bob earlier. We have to put a constant in there, and our constant is a space in brackets. And then if we tried to close, it wouldn't work, because we have to now concatenate or put those brackets together with what's on the other side of them, what's on the right side of them. So I got to put another ampersand in there. And now that I've done that, when I close this window, let's see, there we go. And that's how we arrive at our name, putting these 2 fields together. So if this says Bill, it just changes and takes those values and puts them together in the calculation. If you tell FileMaker that the result of your calculation is a number, then it's going to index that field in a different way than if you tell it that it's text. And that's going to affect your search results when you're performing a find. Let's move on and talk about functions. A function is a named, predefined formula with parameters upon which it acts. It's a calculation that we give a name to, and that calculation is all canned. It's behind the scenes. We don't get to see it. All we get to do is feed it values in what's called a parameter. I'm going to explain that. It's actually way easier than it sounds. I'm going to, oh, by the way, so remember I said that over here on the right side, we've got all of our functions. We can actually, if we switch how we're viewing them, we can view them all by name, and we can scroll through, and there's an incredible number of functions in here. I happen to know, and we can search for them, right? So we can start typing, and FileMaker narrows our results. Incredibly useful, highly recommend it, but there's an even better way. And so I'm going to show you what that is right now. So if we go right in here into where we're actually creating our calculation, and we start to type Same thing happens. FileMaker gives us type ahead right in our calculation window. This is incredibly useful. If we just remember what a function starts with, we can get there. We don't have to go and look it up. We can just start typing. FileMaker is going to show us, get us on the right track and help us to find the results. I'm going to choose one that's called day name. I'm going to double click on it. And it tells us what it needs as a parameter. A parameter is a value that you pass in to the function. And when you pass that value in, it does something for you. If we want to know what day name does, well, we can click on it over here on the right, and we can look down at the bottom, and it says, returns text that is the full name of the weekday for a date. Well, let's try that out. I'm going to put a date in here. I'm going to put in, what's today's date? It is the 8th month, 7th day, 2018. I think that's right. So, whoops. Now, I have to put that in quotation marks, because otherwise FileMaker is going to think like, oh, you're naming a field right now. But we're not doing that. So I'm putting that date in. I'm going to click on OK, and boom, there it is. So that's today's date. Now, really interesting thing about this is there are other ways that we can fill in that parameter. We could say, there's another function in here. There's a whole bunch of functions that are called get functions. Get functions are a type of function in here that doesn't take any value, any parameter. It just gets its values from the environment. So from the computer that you're working on, from the database that you're working in, etc. So I'm going to create a get function. It's called get current date. So get current date just returns today's date, whatever today happens to be. Tomorrow it's going to be returning the date of tomorrow. And yesterday it's going to return yesterday's date. So it always returns whatever today's date is. I'm going to stick that in. So now we've got one function taking as a parameter another function. So we can nest our functions in this way. So when I do that, no big surprise, it's still going to say Tuesday because it's still Tuesday. So I'm going to go back in. I'm going to remember a minute ago I said it's really valuable to know how FileMaker is storing these things underneath. Well, it turns out that FileMaker is storing dates as the number of days since January 1st in the year 0001 or the year 00000001. It's the same year. It's January 1st in the very first year. So it's the number of days since then. So knowing that, we can say get current date plus 1, and now it's going to show us the day name of today's date plus 1, which means tomorrow. So there we go, Wednesday. So knowing how FileMaker is storing things underneath really gives you some power. I'm going to switch gears now for a second, and I'm going to show you another way that we can look at or create calculations in FileMaker, and that's using something called Data Viewer. The Data Viewer is only in FileMaker Advanced. If you have FileMaker 17, you have FileMaker Advanced because FileMaker now is only Advanced. There's no regular version of the product. But for versions prior to 17, you actually have to be using FileMaker Advanced to get to use the Data Viewer. And for that, you just go under the Tools menu, and you choose Data Viewer, and here it is. There are two tabs here. One's called Current. The Current will show you the values in any fields that are part of the currently running script. So you use this in conjunction with the script debugger as you're stepping through your script step by step by step, and you can see the values in here changing. We're not running a script right now, so it's empty. Over here on the watch side, this allows us to create some calculations, keep them around, and watch their values. We can have this little data viewer window off on the side if we had a bigger monitor, and we could be doing things, working in our database and looking at the data viewer to see how it's affecting calculations that we're working on. This is sort of a great testing ground for calculations. Not only that, it's kind of a useful place to put in some basic things about your environment. So there's a calculation called getApplicationVersion that just pulls in the version of the application you're currently using, or getHostName, so that you know if you're connected to a server, which server you're connected to, that sort of a thing. So these things can be really useful to keep around, and they stay around until you delete them. Let's create one right here. I'm going to click down here. There's a plus button to add an expression. When I do that, it opens up the calculation window, just like we were looking at a minute ago, only something really interesting. Down at the bottom, you can see that it shows us the result of our calculation. So we can put in a first name, and remember we changed it to Bill, and then we can put in our quotes, and then put in our last name, and last name, and there we go. Now, the important thing to understand about the data viewer and the way that it works is it's returning a result based on whatever record we're currently on. So whatever layout we're sitting on, whatever record we're on. So I'm going to, so if I flip through, watch what I'm going to do here. I'm going to zoom in a little. And when I flip through, notice that my calculation is changing based on what record I'm on right now. It's an important thing to understand because that means that your calculations are evaluating from the context of, that means from the layout that you're sitting on right now when you're viewing. So if you're not getting the expected results, it could be because you have multiple windows open and you're not looking at them from the right standpoint. I'm going to talk about context a little bit more in just a couple of minutes. Let me go back in there. Talk a little bit about, well, remember we said that we had some comparative operators here like greater than or less than. FileMaker is always using Boolean logic for evaluation. So if I say 5 is greater than 3, it's going to return a 1. 1 means, in Boolean logic, that means true. If I say 5 equals 3, it's going to return a, anybody? It's going to return a 0 because in Boolean logic, 0 means false. So in Boolean logic, we only have trues and falses. We have 1s and 0s. And in fact, if I type true into a calculation window, FileMaker displays the result as 1. It's the only time you can type a word in here that's not the name of a field and not the name of a function, and FileMaker doesn't get confused by that or wonder what you're doing. Same if I type in false. False comes back as a 0. So let's do this. I'm going to say get current time. And it shows me down in my results the current time. Oh, wow, are we ever behind? And now I'm going to add to that, say 3600, which is the number of seconds in an hour. And it's going to show me the time 1 hour from now. Well, that's because FileMaker underneath is storing time as the number of seconds since midnight. Similarly, if I said get current timestamp, FileMaker is storing timestamps as the number of seconds since, believe it or not, the first day of the first month of the first year. So 110001. And so knowing that, we can add things to timestamps as well. So if we wanted to add 12 hours, let me think, that's probably about 43,200 seconds. I wrote that down. So that's 12 hours from now. All right, the other thing I want to show you here has to do with the way text is stored. Remember a minute ago I said text is stored as Unicode. So what that means is there's a function in FileMaker called code. By the way, I'm telling you these things just so that you get how it works. I'm not showing you a function right now that's super valuable that you're going to be using every day. I'm trying to give you a foundation in this, and then you can take this and run with it in whatever direction you want to run. So FileMaker has a function called code. Code takes as its value some text. Down below it says table missing because it's trying to evaluate text, and it's wondering, well, I don't know. In this particular, when we're in the data viewer, it's looking for the table and then the name of the field within the table. It needs it to be fully qualified, and we're not doing that, so it's saying, hey, I don't know how to evaluate this. Code is looking for some text. So I'm going to put in the value A, and I'm going to get the Unicode value for the letter A, which happens to be 65. There is another function called char for character, and it takes a value as a number as its parameter. Well, we know that code A is returning the value 65, so that's a number. I'm just going to cut that. I'm going to paste that in, and sure enough, we've now gone in a circle, and it's showing me that my result is A. Well, because we know that it's the Unicode value 65, we could add something to code A. We could say plus 1 and look at what we get. We get B. So we can do some really powerful, really cool things in our calculations just by understanding how they're stored inside of FileMaker. Now I'm going to move really fast, and I'm going to show you how to do a few cool things in other parts of FileMaker. There are some really awesome things that you can do in FileMaker with calculations that are super useful in your interface. And the very first one that I'm going to look at is talk about how we can show or hide objects depending on the results of a calculation. In this particular case, I'm going to just take this whole block of stuff right here, and I'm going to over into the inspector area. The inspector allows you to control the properties of the objects that are on your layouts. I just closed it, I'll open it again. There's a shortcut for that. And you can see one of the things we can do is we can hide objects when. So I've got a group of objects selected, and one of the objects I have selected here is a button, by the way. I'm going to come back to that in a second. When you click on that button, it would do something in my database. I'm going to hide objects when. Well, one of the things that you can do here is when this evaluates to true, the objects are going to hide. So look at what I can do. It's reminding me right down here at the bottom. Non-zero values are true. So anything that's 1 or greater is true. 0 and empty values are false. If I just put a number 1 in here, I can hide those objects on my layout. Boom, there they go. Guess how you could use this? You could have a block of text where you're writing a note to yourself as a developer, and you could just put a 1 on that and then hide that so it's always hiding, but when you go into layout mode, there it is. So you can see it, but your end users can't. Well, there's some other types of things that we can do with that. Instead, I'm going to go in here, and I'm going to say, I'm going to open up my calculation window. I'm going to take that 1 out, and I'm going to say, there's a function called left. I'm going to use the left function. We can see what parameters it's looking for here. It's looking for some text, and it's looking for us to tell it how many characters. And it's going to return whatever number of characters we specify, counting from the left. For the text I'm going to put in, I'm going to use the name of the customer. So I grabbed the customer field and I stuck that in there. And I said, all right, counting from the left, take the very first value. So the very first letter, counting from the left, I should say. And I'm going to say, if that equals the letter E, then this whole thing is going to evaluate to true, and it's going to hide those objects. Well, sure enough, my customer name is Exoteric. That's the name of my company. All that stuff is missing now. I'm going to flip through the records. Still on Exoteric, now on ABC Inc. It's showing up again. Back to Exoteric, not showing up. So we can control whether things display in our interface based on a calculation. The calculation can do all kinds of powerful things. It could be, hey, if the current user, one of our functions is get account name, so the account that someone logged in with. If the current user is this person, then display something. If it's not them, don't display it. Remember I said there was a button here? That button is hidden as well. I can't click on that anymore. Not only can I get into those fields there or see what's in them, but I also can't click on that button. So I can do some basic control of things in my interface. It's incredibly powerful. Another thing that we could do is we can create tooltips. Tooltips allow you to hover over objects in your interface and give a prompt to the person that's using them. So I'm going to just select this button that I've got right here, and I'm going to go in here to the tooltip area. I'm going to open up my calculation window, And oh, hey, the tooltip's already in there. Well, I'm going to explain a couple things to you, though. First thing I want to do is, in this case, I'm going to say, hey, if there's a company number that's in there, then I'm going to tell the user that they can change the company number. But if there's no company number in there, I'm going to tell them that they can add a company number, okay, by clicking on that button. So we've got a condition now in our logic. And to put conditions into a calculation, we use one of the most powerful functions, which is called case. And I'm just going to bring it up here. I'm going to explain to you how to read it. Case says this. We're going to perform a test. If that test evaluates to true, then we're going to return some result. Our results could be literal text. It could be like a text constant, or it could be a value from another field, or it could be some other value returned by another function, by another get function in our database. This is incredibly powerful. Notice that there's curly brackets, and then confusion. Why is there a second test, and what does that mean? And then a dot, 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 and a default result. Well, turns out that everything in the curly brackets is optional. And what it's telling us is, it's telling us if we want to have more than one test, we can do that. In fact, we can have as many, the dot, dot, dot means we can have as many tests as we want. And FileMaker, this is very important to know, starts with the first test, evaluates, and if it does not hit true, if it does not evaluate to true, it goes to the next one and evaluates. And then it goes to the next one and evaluates. It stops evaluating as soon as it gets to something that's true. This is a valuable thing for you to know, because sometimes when you are performing these tests, a test is really a formula. The formula can be very complicated. And it could be pulling data from other tables in your database, other related tables, and things that a FileMaker can't store in an index and doesn't have ready access to, and that can get slow. And so you're better off sometimes to put the most likely thing to pass the test first. You also need to know that if it's possible for two things to pass the test, you have to have an ordering so that the one that you want to pass first comes first in the calculation, and then the one that you want to say, well, if it misses this one, then I care about this next. We need to have a ranking, a sort of a priority in the way we set these up. It's a little more advanced, but it's just good to know that this is how it works. Here's another thing. I'm going to make this 1,000 times easier to read just by doing this. Remember I said before, FileMaker skips spaces. Well, it also skips carriage returns. Just ignores them when it's evaluating in here. So unless I put my carriage returns or my spaces in quotation marks, FileMaker does not evaluate them. And that means that we can do things like this. We could have, now are you seeing it? We can have test 1, test 2, test 3, etc. We can have as many of these tests as we want, and FileMaker will keep going until it gets to true. And if it doesn't hit a test that's true, then we can put in some default result. So if it goes all the way through and it doesn't get what we're looking for, then display this, or then use this value. That's what this means. Let's do that. We're going to put some tests in here. So I'm going to say case. So I'm going to say case. What I want to know is there a value in here? And there's a function called IsEmpty. And IsEmpty is just looking for the name of any field. And so what I'm saying is this empty? And if it's empty, then my result is going to be add a customer. That's what I'm going to show. But I'm going to have another one. I'm going to say not is empty. And in there, I'm going to say, so in other words, if it's not the case that it's empty, in other words, if it's got something in it, then that same field, then I'm going to say change customer. Oops, like that. By the way, because of the logic right here, I didn't need to put this in as another this. Rather, this is the opposite of this. It's the logical counterpart to this. So if we just took this out, we could just have that as our this right here rather as our default result. So either this is true or that's true. It works in the same way. So when we do that and we go and we hover, see it's saying change customer, and if I take the value out of there, when I hover, it is now saying add a customer. Pretty simple, pretty cool, could be useful. Let's look over here in the salesperson field. Well, let's suppose that we want to draw attention to the fact that there should be a value in there. Well, we can do something called conditional formatting. I'm just going to right-click on this field, and a contextual menu comes up. Try right-clicking all over the place in FileMaker and see what menus come up. Menus that are useful in the context in which you're currently working will frequently appear. So in this case, we can see there's conditional formatting. Conditional formatting allows us to format our field or the text in our field depending on some condition. So I'm going to use a formula right now. And FileMaker tries to be helpful and puts in some stuff that you usually don't need. I'm just going to take that out, and I'm going to open up my calculation window again. And I'm going to say that if the salesperson field is empty, so I'm going to use my IsEmpty function. It needs a field. There's the field. I'll just cut it and paste it in. IsEmpty. When that's true, when it's true that it's empty, then I'm going to fill that field with this yellow. All right? And I could also do something like change the color of my text, underline, strike through. There's different text formatting that we can add as well. So it could be something like, hey, if it's greater than 30 days past due, change this value to red. Display the text or the number in this field in red. So the kinds of things we can do with conditional formatting. Again, incredibly powerful way to make our data come alive and make it more useful. So I'm going to say OK. I'm going to go back into browse mode. I'm going to take the name of the salesperson out. And boom, there it is. So we're alerting our user to the fact that, hey, the yellow fields are the ones we really care about. We want to make sure that you've got something in there. I'm going to show you one more. It's called placeholder text. This allows us to show a value in a field that's not the field's value. It's just telling you something about that field that you're going to enter data in. It's a little bit confusing way of putting it probably, but you'll see in a second here. So I go over here, placeholder text. So I've selected this field called terms. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, click on my calculation window, and I'm going to say, hey, if the customer name equals Exoteric Inc. So I'm going to say case, customer field equals Exoteric Inc. Then return this value, which is going to say like does not have credit. Otherwise, I'm going to say does have credit. Okay, and I'm going to close my brackets. And there we go. So now you can see that when our company name over here is Exoteric, in the field it says, hey, this customer doesn't have credit. It could be doing something like this. It could be reminding us that this is the first name field or the last name field or something along those lines if we didn't want to put in text labels. As soon as we go in and we enter any data, like any data at all, that goes away. So placeholder text is just a way of indicating something to the end user about what data is going to go into that field. And if we were on a record for a different company, of course, it would be displaying does have credit. Okay? There's different ways that we could make that useful in our environment. I'm going to show you a couple of interesting things really quickly. So I'm going to find this contact. I happen to know there's 5 records in here that are all using this contact, and we can see up here at the top there are 5 records in our current found set. Okay, I'm going to show you something really cool and extraordinarily dangerous that we can do with calculations in FileMaker. So notice that this contact right here, which is me, there's a phone number for this contact. I'm going to go to the next record, I'm just going to flip to the next record. You can see it's a different phone number. And when I go to the next record after that, you can see that, oh, the next bunch of records, there's no phone number whatsoever. Suppose that I want to pull in phone numbers for this particular contact back from the companies area in my database. Well, it so happens that I've got a relationship between my contact number right here and the contacts area, or the company area in my database. I'm going to go into the company area, and we're just going to look at this contact. So there I am, Doug Gardner, and there's my phone number, my information. So the information exists. Imagine instead of 5 records, we had 500 records or 5,000 records. We could go through and use a step called replace field contents to replace the contents of that field with the result of a calculation. I'm going to go back to the very first record. Notice that its phone number here is 416-444-444-444. When I go to the next record, it's 416-414-0272. Back in the contacts area, this is the phone number that I really normally use. I gave this other phone number because I knew that on the day that the salesperson might be calling me, I'm going to be at a different location. So I want them to reach me at this location. We don't want to wipe out all of this data that's already in here, but we want to make sure that the records in the records that don't have any data in them get the data that they need. There's a couple ways of doing this. The really smart way would be to perform our find again and find the ones that just have no values in that field, that are just empty in that field. But there's a really powerful thing that we can do that's, in this case, dangerous, but in many other cases, well, it's always dangerous. And I'm going to explain why in just 1 second. So we're going to do this. We're going to click in that field. We're going to create a calculation. So we're going to go to Replace Field Contents. Here's our calculation. There's our calculation window. What I'm going to do is I'm going to say IsEmpty. And I'm going to say, okay, if the contact cell phone number field is empty, then I'm going to put in the cell phone number based on a relationship to the contacts table that I happen to have access to here. So I just went in. Here's my current layout, my current table, and the related tables. Well, I have a relationship from my quote to my contacts based on the contact number, and I'm going to grab in that contact's cell phone number. Now, if it's not empty, I want to replace it with the value that it already has. So in other words, I don't have a way of telling it to skip this record, not using this method I'm using right now. I'm going to, in effect, tell it, well, don't make any change. Just take whatever number you already have in there. So let's read this. So I'm saying, here's my test. Is it empty? If the answer to that's yes, then go and grab that value from that other table. If the answer is no, then put in the value that's already in there. And when we run through that, why is this incredibly dangerous? Because we could be running through a huge number of records in our database and completely trashing everything just because we made a mistake in our calculation. Back up, do an export of your data, make sure you've gotten proper approval from the authorities, whatever it might be. This is a kind of a dangerous move because we're going through and we're changing a whole bunch of data all at once. But we're going to do it anyway, and boom, there it is. Now look at this. My 444-444 number's still there, but all the others got replaced with that value that got pulled in from that other table. Very, very powerful, very useful way of dealing with large amount of data all at once. You can create really complicated calculations that are looking at the value in that field that you're changing and getting them to run some operations on that value in that field. You could say, if there was a big text block in there, like you typed a whole bunch of notes or something into a field, you could do a replace on it, a substitute, and substitute one value for another value throughout that field. There's all kinds of really cool things you could do with calculations, manipulating your data in this way. The area in the database where FileMaker uses calculations the most is probably in scripts. Now, there's no possible way that in an hour we can go through and show you all the different ways that you could use calculations in scripts. So I'm not even going to try. Instead, I want to leave you with a very fundamental piece of knowledge about this, something that you hopefully can use over and over again. So, fun fact, nearly half of the 165 script steps in FileMaker can use calculations. I'm just going to jump in. I'm going to show you a script that's in my database here. So we've got a script for printing quotes. I'm going to go up to the script menu, go into the script workspace, and I'm going to find my print quote script. There it is. Now, don't worry, we're not going to read all the way through this thing, but I want to explain something to you. One of the things that you can do in a script is move around your database. You can go from one layout to another layout to another layout. When you're moving around from layout to layout, you're doing what we call a context change. Each of the layouts in your database is sitting on a table occurrence in your relationship graph. These are all table occurrences. We can have all the layouts in our database are sitting on top of these table occurrences. When we go from one layout to another, we're moving, in effect, from one table occurrence to another. We're moving to whatever table occurrence that layout happens to be sitting on. When we perform a calculation inside of a script, we see something like this. Here's a calculation. It's called set variable. We're setting a variable with the value of a calculation. Variables are containers that we create on the fly as we need them as a place to store something temporarily. FileMaker's got a few different types of containers. One of them is called a local variable. That means it's local to the script in which it's running. And local variables, it tells us right up above here, start with a $sign. That variable, that container that I'm creating, lives for the duration of the script. When that script ends, that container goes away. Whatever value is stored in it is now lost. We can't retrieve it. Another type of variable is a global variable. When there's two $signs in front, that means our container persists. It lives, continues to live after the script in which we created it. It lives until we close down FileMaker, until we change that value. So it lives throughout our session in FileMaker, just for the current user. If someone's on another machine connected to the same server, the value in that variable for them can be different because it's session specific. Okay, so we're going to set this variable to the result of a calculation. And in this particular case, it's totally simple. We're just saying return whatever's in the quote number field. Look at what it says up here at the top. This calculation will be evaluated based on context determined at runtime. This is talking about the context that's established as your script moves from layout to layout. So as it moves from table occurrence on your relationship graph to table occurrence on your relationship graph. Because remember what I said, all of the layouts, in fact, if we go in here to manage layouts, we see that all the layouts in our database are associated with some table occurrence. It says up at the top, associated table. So that's misleading. FileMaker is not doing a good job of explaining exactly what it is. It's a table occurrence that's on your relationship graph. So when you're moving from one layout to another, you can be switching from one context to another. What does that mean? Well, to help answer that question, I'm going to explain this. Here we've got a bunch of line items in a quotation, and we've got a bunch of values. Extended just means is number people speak for multiplying a quantity times a price to give us the extension of that or the product of that. So the extended value here is the quantity times the price. We want to be able to go along and sum that down here and give us a subtotal. So in order to do that, I'm going to go into my fields, and I have a subtotal field, and the calculation for that is currently hasn't been written. And now notice that it changes a little bit what it says here, evaluation of this calculation from the context of. So it doesn't say from a context established at runtime, because we're right now in our field definition. So we're not running around the database in a script. We're in a field, and that field is connected to a table in our database. And because it's connected to a table in our database, we have access to all the table occurrences on our relationship graph that are based on that same table. How do we know what our context is here? How to tell it to evaluate? Well, we actually don't. No matter how long you've been working in the FileMaker world, there's no way you can answer the question that's before us right now just by looking at this list of options. We need to understand a little bit about how our database is constructed. So I'm going to cancel out of this, and I'm going to go back into our relationship graph. And well, actually, I'm going to go back into our layout. I'm going to say, okay, what layout are we on right now? Well, we're on a table occurrence called QOT. That's my short form for quote. And if I go back to my relationship graph now, and I take a look at QOT, that means I'm on a layout that's sitting right here. It's like I'm sitting on top of a mountain called QOT. And what can I see from that mountain? In other words, what things are related to the record that I'm sitting on in QOT right now? And the answer to that is all of these things. These are the things that I can currently see. So I'm sitting here, I'm looking out from here over all these things. I've got some table abbreviations here. QLN stands for quote lines. So my quote line table, I'm sitting here, I'm looking through into a portal that's based on this right here, QOT, QLN, quote number. When I close this down and we look at the name of the portal, QLT, QLN, quote number. I'm sitting on this layout. This layout is sitting on this table occurrence. This table occurrence is giving me a pointer through that portal through to right here, through to this table occurrence, these related quote lines. So let's go back into our fields, and now we're in a position to create our calculation. I'm going to go in here, evaluate this calculation from the context of. Well, remember, we're sitting on QOT, so we're going to evaluate it from the context of QOT. And when we're sitting at QOT, we want to look through from QOT, from that QOT mountain, all the way through to the QOT, QLN table occurrence that was on our graph. And when we do that, we can now use a function called sum. And sum allows us to sum the value in a field. When it's a related field, we just have to put the name of that field in. We're going to take the extended amount right here. We're going to sum that. And sure enough, now we're getting a subtotal of all those related records showing up here. And we're also now a little bit clearer on what it means to be evaluating something from the context of. Because remember back in our script that we were looking at, when we were in here and we were looking at our calculation, and our calculation said it's going to be evaluated based on context determined at runtime. So if we had been, in this particular case, it doesn't matter so much because we're just grabbing a value out of the quote that we're currently sitting on. But we could be grabbing a value out of a related record that we were sitting on. We wouldn't be able to get that value. We wouldn't be able to, let's say, if we wanted to grab the extended amount from the quote line, we wouldn't be able to get that extended value unless our script step, we had a go to layout script step that had navigated us to the correct context. We would need to navigate to a layout that's based on, in other words, sitting on the right spot in our relationship graph. Some script steps require the presence of the field on the layout, whereas others don't? And the answer to that is yes. So there are certain script steps like cut and paste that require the field that you're cutting and pasting to be on the layout. I believe that to be true. I'm going to thank everybody for coming and encourage everyone to fill out their evaluation forms. If you want to stay behind for a couple of minutes for a few more questions, then that's great. But otherwise, thank you very much.